The cemetery was silent, the air thick with sorrow. A lone woman stood before a freshly sealed tomb, her fingers trembling as she held a small camera in her hands. Her name was Emily Carter, a mother whose heart had been shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Just days ago, she had buried her only son, Jacob, a boy full of life, laughter, and dreams that would never come true. He was just 10 years old. The grief was unbearable, an invisible weight crushing her every second of the day. But as much as the pain consumed her, there was something else. A feeling she couldn't explain, a presence she couldn't ignore. It started the night of the funeral. Emily sat in Jacob's empty room, clutching his favorite stuffed animal, staring at the bed he would never sleep in again. The world outside continued, as if nothing had happened, but for her, time had stopped. Then she heard it, a faint sound, barely more than a whisper. It was coming from the baby monitor she had never turned off, the one she used to check on him at night, even though he had long outgrown it. Her heart pounded. She leaned in, listening closely. The static buzzed in her ears. And then, a voice, a soft, distant sound that sent chills down her spine. "Mom!" It was Jacob's voice. Emily's breath hitched. She jumped to her feet, rushing down the hall, hoping, praying, that somehow this was all a mistake, a cruel trick of the mind. But Jacob wasn't there. Of course, he wasn't. She collapsed onto the floor, clutching her chest as silent sobs racked her body. Was grief making her imagine things? Or was there something else, something she wasn't ready to face? In the days that followed, strange things kept happening. His bedroom door, which he always kept closed, would be slightly ajar. His favorite toy truck, which he had packed away, appeared on the living room floor. Lights flickered. Shadows moved where they shouldn't. At first, Emily dismissed them as tricks of the mind, the effects of exhaustion and grief. But deep down, she felt it. She wasn't alone. That's when the idea came to her. It was reckless, maybe even absurd, but she needed answers. She needed to know if she was losing her mind or if, somehow, in some way, Jacob was still here. She purchased a small motion-activated camera, the kind used for security surveillance, and in the dead of night, under the glow of a pale moon, she found herself at the cemetery, kneeling before his tombstone. With shaky hands, she placed the camera inside a small opening in the marble, a space just large enough to hold the device without it being seen. She pressed record, whispered a soft, tearful goodbye, and left. Days passed. She barely slept, constantly debating whether or not to retrieve the footage. What if there was nothing? What if it was just silence, darkness? Would that finally force her to accept reality? Or worse, what if there was something? Something she wasn't prepared to see. On the 5th day, she could no longer bear the uncertainty. She drove to the cemetery, her stomach in knots, her hands ice cold against the steering wheel. The moment she retrieved the camera, her heart raced. She hurried home, locked the door behind her, and sat at her desk. The device clutched tightly in her hands. She hesitated before pressing play. The screen flickered, the footage beginning with nothing but the still, cold interior of the tomb. The first hours showed nothing, just darkness, silence. But then, something changed. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw it. A flicker, a movement, and then Jacob's voice, soft, clear, calling out for her. Emily's hands flew to her mouth, a cold shiver running down her spine. The footage wasn't over, and whatever was coming next would change everything. Emily's fingers trembled as she rewound the footage, her pulse pounding in her ears. She wasn't imagining it. Jacob's voice was real. But how? It had been days since she laid him to rest. Her mind raced through possibilities. Was this some kind of interference? A glitch? But deep down, she knew. This was different. She forced herself to keep watching, her eyes glued to the screen. The small, dimly lit space inside the tomb remained motionless, the silence stretching unbearably. Then, a faint rustling sound. It was soft at first, almost like the gentle shifting of fabric. Emily leaned in closer, her heart hammering. A shadow flickered across the frame, barely noticeable but there. And then, Jacob's voice again. This time, clearer. "Mom, I'm cold," Emily gasped, nearly knocking over the laptop. She clutched her chest, her breath shallow. The words echoed in her mind, freezing her to her core. This wasn't some distant, distorted whisper. It was direct, real, desperate. Tears welled in her eyes. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice breaking. She reached for the screen as if she could touch him, as if she could pull him back from wherever he was. But the footage continued. Another noise, this time a soft tapping. It was rhythmic, deliberate, not random interference. It was coming from inside the tomb. Emily's stomach twisted into knots. The rational part of her mind told her this was impossible, but another part, the one clinging to hope, to the love a mother would never let go of, told her there was more to this. She played the footage again, over and over, analyzing every frame, every second of sound. She checked the camera settings, trying to find an explanation, but there was nothing wrong with the device, no technical errors, no reason for the voice of her son to be recorded inside his tomb. And yet, there it was. The next morning, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She needed to go back to the cemetery. Maybe she was losing her mind. Maybe the grief had twisted reality beyond recognition. But she couldn't ignore this. She had to know. The drive felt longer than usual. The cemetery was eerily quiet. The sky overcast, casting a grey shadow over the endless rows of headstones. She parked near Jacob's grave, her legs weak as she stepped out. The weight of the past week crashed down on her. The air felt heavier here, charged with something she couldn't explain. As she approached his tomb, her fingers brushed against the cold stone. A lump formed in her throat. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Are you here?" Silence. Just the wind whispering through the trees. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath. Maybe she was hoping for too much. Maybe. A soft sound broke the silence. Emily's eyes snapped open. The tapping. It was faint, but unmistakable. She stepped back, her heart racing. The same rhythmic tapping from the recording. It was coming from inside. She staggered away, her mind spinning. This wasn't possible. This wasn't happening. And yet, every instinct told her it was real. She rushed home, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly. Her knuckles turned white. She had to find out more. If this was a sign, if Jacob was trying to tell her something, she had to listen. That night, she didn't sleep. She combed through old home videos, listening to Jacob's voice, comparing it to the one in the recording. It was identical. Every inflection, every pause, unmistakably his. Memories flooded her mind. His laughter, his warmth, the way he used to hug her so tightly, as if he never wanted to let go. She buried her face in her hands, trying to hold herself together. Then, she thought of something. Jacob's school journal. She hadn't touched it since he passed. It was tucked away in a box of his belongings, too painful to look through. But now she needed to. She pulled it out, her hands unsteady, as she flipped through the pages. His handwriting, messy, full of life, stared back at her, and then she found it, a drawing, one that made her blood run cold. It was a picture of his own tombstone, drawn, weeks before he had passed. In shaky, uneven letters beneath it, he had written, "Mom, don't leave me alone." Emily's breath caught in her throat. Tears blurred her vision. How had he known? Why would he draw something like this? A wave of realization crashed over her. This wasn't just grief playing tricks on her. Jacob had tried to tell her something before he was even gone. And now, from wherever he was still trying. But what was he trying to say? Emily clenched the journal against her chest, her mind reeling. There was only one way to find out. She had to go back. She had to listen. No matter what she found. Emily stood in the doorway of her bedroom, gripping Jacob's journal tightly. The weight of everything, the voice in the recording, the tapping from the tomb, the eerie drawing, pressed down on her like an invisible force. A part of her wanted to run, to forget, to let grief settle in its own quiet way. But a stronger part, the part that had carried Jacob for 9 months, nursed him through fevers, and kissed his scraped knees, refused to turn away. She had to go. Back. The night air was crisp when she arrived at the cemetery. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their shadows stretching long and thin under the dim glow of the streetlights. She parked her car, hesitating for only a moment before stepping out. The cold seeped through her sweater, but she barely noticed. Her heart pounded as she approached Jacob's tomb. This time, she didn't whisper his name. She didn't even breathe. She simply listened. At first, nothing. Just the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of the city. Then slowly, a sound began to form, a soft rhythmic tapping. Emily's chest tightened. Her hand shook, but she forced herself to stay. "I'm here," she whispered. "Jacob, I'm here." Silence. Then the voice, small, fragile, and heartbreakingly familiar. "Mom, don't leave me." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I won't, baby," she choked out. "I won't." She pressed her palms against the cold marble. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to fix this, but she knew, without a doubt, that Jacob was trying to reach her. He wasn't at peace. Her mind raced. Was it because of the way he passed? The sudden illness that had taken him so fast, so cruelly? Was it something unfinished, something he had wanted to tell her? Then, as if in response to her thoughts, she felt it, a warmth spreading through her fingertips. It was subtle, but unmistakable, and in that moment, she knew. Jacob wasn't trapped. He wasn't suffering. He was holding on, because she was. Her grief, her unwillingness to let go, was keeping him here. The tapping, the voice. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pain. It was love. A love so strong, so unbreakable, that even death couldn't sever it. But now, she had to do the hardest thing a mother could ever do. She had to let him go. Emily closed her eyes, her tears falling freely. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice steady, despite the ache in her heart. "I love you. I love you more than anything in this world. And I will always, always be your mum." She swallowed hard, placing a gentle hand against the tomb. "But it's okay, sweetheart. You don't have to stay. You can rest now." The wind picked up, circling around her in a soft, almost comforting embrace. And then, just as quickly as it began, the tapping stopped. The air felt lighter. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was peaceful. Emily exhaled shakily, pressing a final kiss to her fingers before touching the cold marble one last time. She knew in the deepest part of her soul that Jacob was safe, that he was free, and as she walked away, The stars above her seemed to shine just a little brighter.